I'm Lisa from Undivided. I am our public benefit specialist, and hopefully I can help you kind of get a broad grasp on some of the programs that are available for kids with disabilities in California. Just a couple of things to keep in mind. The information here, I'm giving you sort of general publicly available information. Nothing here is intended to constitute legal advice. Undivided is here to help you navigate the system and save you time, bring you clarity and confidence, and connect you with the best available information and resources, but we are not authorized to provide legal advice. If you need legal advice, please consult with an attorney who can hear the specifics of your particular case and provide you advice. So with that out of the way, we're going to discuss a few programs today. We're going to talk about the regional center a little bit and Medi-Cal, in-home supportive services, also known as IHSS, Social Security, it's Title II and Title 16, California Children's Services. Each one of these each one of these services could be its own presentation. I could sit here and talk for an hour about each one. I'm not going to. We're going to discuss each one in pretty broad terms, and then if you have any specific questions, you'll have some time at the end to ask questions. Okay, so what is a regional center? Regional centers are a statewide network of independently run agencies. They do collaborate and have a consortium, but they are all governed by the Lanterman Act. However, they are each run independently, and so each one has its own purchase of service standards and its own policies. So, sometimes you'll hear like, oh, well, my child is at this regional center and gets this service. That doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be the exact same at your regional center. But generally speaking, the regional center provides services under the Lanterman Act to children who with diagnosed developmental disabilities. Regional Center also provides services for early intervention to kids age 0 to 3 who are at risk for or diagnosed with developmental delays. And Regional Center is your Regional Center assignment is based on your zip code. So before age 3, the services that children will receive are through the Early Start program, which is regulated by Part C of the federal IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the same law that governs special ed once children turn 3. It's just a different section of the same law that regulates special education. After age 3, children will only retain eligibility if they have a diagnosed developmental disability that constitutes a substantial disability. And substantial disability, so there's 5 main areas where diagnoses for regional center eligibility. The first is intellectual disability. Second is cerebral palsy. Third is epilepsy. The fourth is autism spectrum disorder. Well, autism is how it's labeled. And then the 5th category is something, it's usually people just call it 5th category. It's conditions that are closely related to intellectual disability or require treatment that's similar to what you'd provide for a person with intellectual disability, and is not completely physical or medical in nature. So sometimes you'll have a child whose numbers are not quite where it needs to be to qualify under ID, but maybe they have lower adaptive scores, and that kind of results in functionally the same condition. They'll usually qualify under the 5th category. And a substantial disability means that they have significant delays in at least 3 areas among self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, and self-direction. And then when they're older, they'll also look at capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. And sometimes kids will turn 3, but either they don't have a diagnosis yet, even though they have a bunch of delays, or they have a diagnosis, but they're only delayed in maybe 2 of the 3 areas. And you might start to see that gap between them, and they're typically developing peers grow as they get a little bit older, but at 3, it may be a little bit too soon. For those children, there's provisional eligibility, which means that the child can get basically nearly all of the same services that a child would get under the Lanterman Act, but they will be reevaluated right before their 5th birthday to see if they continue to qualify outside of provisional eligibility. So, okay. So the regional center is the payer of last resort. You'll hear that a lot when you're dealing with the regional center. They will only fund a service if no generic resource is available. And generic resources, basically any other agency or entity that's responsible for providing the service, or services that are available to the general public. So like, community daycare, community summer camps, Medi-Cal and insurance are very often, those are some of the main generic resources for a lot of the services that the regional center might provide. But you're always going to hear them say the payer of last resort. So anytime you want the regional center to fund something, you're going to have, and it's something that somebody else might usually pay for, you're going to have to bring a denial to them. If you want something that would usually be paid for by insurance, you're going to have to bring a written denial from your insurance showing that it's either not a covered benefit or that you've exhausted all your benefits with the insurance, but it's still medically necessary. So just be prepared to bring documentation of why any other agencies that would usually be responsible are not able to fund it. So let's talk about Medi-Cal now. And again, if you have any regional center questions, you can ask when we open our Q&A period. So you may have heard the words Medicaid and Medicare in discussion of public health care coverage, especially right now. Medicare is linked to Social Security, disability, and retirement benefits, and we're not really going to get into that today. Medicaid is need-based healthcare coverage that's linked to household income, and then there's also some programs to give people access based on disability and a few other factors. Each state runs its own Medicaid program, and it's funded by both state and federal funds. Medi-Cal is California's version of the federal Medicaid program. So when you hear people talking about Medicaid, in California, that's Medi-Cal. So there's 4 main ways that people are going to qualify for Medi-Cal as a person with disabilities. The first is modified adjusted gross income, which is income based. The second is if the person is an SSI recipient, and we'll talk a little bit about SSI later. The third is there's some specific programs that are still income based, but not based on the same criteria as the modified adjusted gross income. And then there's the 1915C home and community-based services waivers. If your child is a regional center client and you are getting Medi-Cal because your income is too high and they put you on what they call the regional center waiver or the institutional deeming waiver, that's this. So generally speaking, if you qualify based on income, you'll be on this first category. And if you don't qualify based on income, the regional centers have a mechanism. And there's a few other Medicaid waivers as well. There's also one for kids with medical or for people in general with medical complexities who aren't regional center clients. But generally, if you're not qualifying based on income, your child can still be potentially eligible for Medi-Cal based solely on their income through institutional deeming. And I just want to let you know, if you see these QR codes throughout the presentation, if you take a screenshot, and we'll send out the slides and the recording, but if you want to take a screenshot, these all link to our expanded articles on each of these topics. So, for a little bit of light reading, feel free to click through and take a look. So how does Medi-Cal work? So Medi-Cal provides healthcare coverage for children and adults through EPSDT, which is the early and periodic screening, diagnostic, and treatment benefit. That's an additional bundle of services and supports that are available to kids under age 21 that are not available to adults. So Medi-Cal pays for most medically necessary healthcare. And we'll talk a little bit about medical necessity, but the definitions are different for children and adult. And so the range of services that Medi-Cal offers is more expensive for children, and the definition of medical necessity is more expensive for children. Nearly all Medi-Cal enrollees at this point are required to choose a managed care plan, which is basically an HMO. From a selection of available plans in your county. Some of the counties, there's a very small subset that are still eligible for fee-for-service based on a different variety of factors, but the vast majority of people are now on a Medi-Cal managed care plan. Some counties have, one or two, some counties have one county run plan and that's it. And some counties have multiple choices that you can look at. Medi-Cal will always pay after private insurance. So in terms of healthcare coverage, like the regional center, Medi-Cal is the payer of last resort. So if you want Medi-Cal to cover something and you have primary insurance, you will need to provide a written denial from your private insurance before Medi-Cal will pay. So Medi-Cal will not cover anything until your private insurance pays its share or issues a denial. And you do need to go to a provider that contracts with Medi-Cal. So let's talk a little bit about IHSS, because this is one of the Medi-Cal services that I hear people ask about most often. In-home supportive services is a Medi-Cal program. Your child has to have Medi-Cal in order to qualify for it. It provides home-based personal care and related services so that people with disabilities can remain safely at home. This is a program that's designed to keep people from being institutionalized by receiving that care in their home. So for children, hours are only awarded for specific services that go above and beyond what you would expect a parent to provide in terms of care for a typically developing child of the same age. So just as you're thinking about IHSS and all the different types of services that it can provide, you always are going to be on that page of what would a parent usually do to provide care for a typically developing child of the same age that doesn't have that disability, because that's how they're going to measure every minute that your child qualifies for. It's going to be whatever is above and beyond. So hours are based on need and not based on diagnosis. So a lot of times parents will say, oh, my child just got diagnosed with this specific diagnosis. How many hours does that translate to? That is not how they gauge it. It's going to be based on your child's specific needs and limitations. So when you have the home visit, don't exaggerate, tell the truth, but sometimes you have to be careful with those humble brags, because what you say will be taken at face value. So you might say, oh, my child took 2 years, but they can finally read their name. And then the social worker might just write down, child can read. And that's like, sometimes they will just take it completely at face value and not hear everything that comes along with what you say. So just be honest, don't exaggerate, but also be aware that what you say will be taken literally. What services will IHSS provide? So there's a range of services that IHSS provides. Some are only available to adults, others are available to everybody. So generally speaking, for everybody, there's domestic services, non-medical, personal care and related services, accompanied to medical appointments, protective supervision, paramedical services, and yard hazard abatement. Domestic services and yard hazard abatement, they're not going to provide that for minors. Because they expect that parents are going to be providing that for kids who, regardless of disability. For non-medical personal care and related services, we're going to talk about that a little bit. That's going to be based on age and what a typically developing child of the same age is expected to do on their own. And then accompaniment to medical appointments is going to depend on the type of medical appointment and whether any services are required on the way or returning. So the non-medical personal care and related services, you can see the list here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But these are just the general categories. There's walking, dressing, bathing, hygiene, transfer. Each of these, I'm going to show you a whole chart that'll explain exactly how they figure out. It's going to just look like a jumble of numbers at first. I will explain what those numbers mean. And then related services, generally, depending on the age, are going to require extraordinary needs. So laundry, they're assuming the parents are going to do laundry for their children anyway. So this is like sort of the chart that can help you decide, when it might be time to apply for IHSS and whether they're going to allot hours. So basically, when IHSS evaluates for need, they rank on a scale of 1 to 5. They rank on a scale of 1 to 5 based on, 1 means completely independent and 5 means the person is totally reliant on another person to do the task for them. What 2 might be like, some verbal prompts, 3 might be a little bit of assistance, 4 is a lot of assistance. So there's a range. You are not going to be asked to assign a number. You just need to tell the caseworker how much assistance your child needs with the task. So anywhere you see a 1 here, a 1 on this chart means the parent would be expected to do that for a typically developing child. So you'll see, under toileting, under bowel and bladder care, it's 1 or a 6. Rank 6 means it's a paramedical service, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. But basically, a rank 6 would be for toileting, would be maybe the child has to be catheterized, maybe they have an ostomy bag. It's a paramedical service, so it's above and beyond what a typically developing infant would require. Otherwise, you get toileting at age 4. You see, dressing, there's assuming, if you can see in that column, you go to dressing, you look at the age. By about 5 years old, they're expecting that a typically developing child would be able to dress themselves. So that's when they'll actually assign a rank to your child. Everywhere where it's just 1 parent, that they assume the child wouldn't be able to do it anyway. If it's 1 or 6, they'll only get hours if it's a paramedical service. And then if it says 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, then it's going to be an actual assessment of the child's individual need. So paramedical services, and this is especially relevant for younger children because, the younger a child is, the more likely it is that the parent would be expected to provide nearly all care anyway, regardless of disability. But paramedical services are an area where younger kids are more likely to get hours. And these are services that have to be ordered and directed by the child's physician or other licensed medical provider. So this is where you need specific training from the doctor in order to do it. They're telling you exactly how much and when. We're teaching you how to gauge how much and when. G-tube feeds and also anything that is going into a hole in the child's body or puncturing the skin. So anything dealing with a stoma, an enema, catheterization, also injections, so home therapy programs, wound care, and then anything that requires you to use judgment that you have learned from the provider. So if your child needs titration of a medication based on their symptoms, that would generally fall under paramedical services, whereas just giving a daily medication at the same time every day, same amount, would fall under a different category. You should put breathing treatments and oxygen onto the paramedical services form. They might reroute it to a different category, but it should still go on this form that's signed by the doctor. So protective supervision is another area where we get a lot of questions. Protective supervision hours are awarded to recipients who require 24/7 supervision to prevent injury to themselves or others due to severely impaired judgment, orientation, or memory. Their actions have to be non-self-directing, and the risk of harm to self or others has to be due to that severe cognitive impairment. So non-self-direction is, you hear self-direction used in a variety of different clinical contexts. For the purpose of IHSS, it means an inability due to a mental impairment or mental illness for individuals to assess danger and the risk of harm, and therefore the individuals would most likely engage in potentially dangerous activities that may cause self-harm. So IHS protective supervision is not awarded for monitoring for spontaneous medical emergencies. So the classic example that they give is you can't get it to watch for a seizure. You can't get it to watch for a heart attack or to watch for an asthma attack. However, you could potentially seek paramedical services hours for some of those services. For example, if a child is not able to communicate their symptoms, you might have to check their pulse ox more often. You might have to check their glucose more often if they're not able to communicate to you when their symptoms are changing. And the other time that you can potentially get protective supervision for a situation that is medical in some way is that there are some kids who require a G-tube or an ostomy bag or a trach or an IV port or central line or a PICC line, and maybe they don't understand what would happen if they remove it, or maybe they move around and they don't understand that could pull it out. And if you have a child who is extremely likely to accidentally dislodge, a life-sustaining device because of their cognitive limitations, that can be a reason for protective supervision. Even though you're monitoring for a medical emergency, the medical emergency is caused by the child's cognitive deficits. Protective supervision is also not available for intentional self-harm or aggressive behavior. And this is where we have to think about the words that we're using and understand that the caseworker will take our words literally. A lot of time the word aggression just means hurting somebody else, and is used without regard to whether or not the child actually intended that. And I would say the same is true of self-harm. If a child is stimming and they're doing something that could accidentally hurt them, that is not the same as intentionally hurting themselves knowing that they could get hurt. Similarly, if a child is, intentionally hitting someone, that's not the same as if a child is dysregulated or overstimulated and they're sort of lashing out and they don't understand that they could hit somebody. So when you discuss your child's behavior, be honest, but don't use words that don't actually apply to your child's behavior just because that's what they're used as, that's how they're used colloquially. So aggression in terms of IHSS, that generally implies they intend to hurt someone. They're doing it on purpose. And it also will not be funded for damage to property as opposed to physical harm or to themselves or someone else. So if, on the other hand, if a child breaks a glass or like knocks over the TV, your concern is not that the glass got broken or that the TV might get broken. Your concern is the child might actually accidentally cut themselves, or the furniture might fall on them. So when you discuss ways in which your child could potentially get hurt, be thinking about they're not going to cover property, and if you only say, my child needs supervision because they like pulled down the furniture, you might have to specify because they could get injured. Don't assume that they're going to make that leap of inference, and understand that you're picturing the potential harm. Some of the frequently asked questions with IHSS, what is the monthly maximum hours? That depends on whether the child is considered severely impaired or non-severely impaired, but generally speaking, the max is either 283 if the child needs more than 80 hours a month of personal care services, or if they need less than that, then for most children, it's going to be whatever hours they're assigned per month, plus if they get protective supervision, 195 hours for protective supervision. So when you get protective supervision, it's 195 hours, and then you get the additional service hours on top of that. Can I be my child's provider? Until recently, the answer was only if it prevents you from working full time, or if there's not another available parent to take care of them. That rule has changed. Every once in a while at this point, you still get workers asking for the parent's work schedule, but they should know by now that it doesn't matter. You can be your child's provider as long as you're eligible to work in the US. You will have to do a background check. There's some limitations based on like prior criminal history for certain crimes. But generally speaking, if you're eligible to work, or the other time that people will not be eligible to work is if you don't have a lawful immigration status that allows you to work in the US. But other than that, generally speaking, you should be able to be your child's provider, or you can hire somebody else to do the hours. Some of the things that we hear often, your child's too young, come back when they're 10 or come back when they're 15. There is no minimum age. If you call and the caseworker says, oh, your child's too young, come back in a few years, you can say, that's okay, I'd like to apply anyway. I can get a denial, but I'd like to apply anyway. Or that's the parent responsibility. All children need that. You have that little chart to see whether that's actually what the expectation is. There's no minimum age. There's no minimum age for protective supervision, although it is harder to get it under age 3. And there's a form that they call the volunteer services form. Generally, we say I would say if nobody's volunteering services, then put nobody's volunteering services that IHSS would otherwise pay for, because sometimes they'll ask you to fill out this form, and then if you say, oh, sometimes my friend watches them for half an hour, they'll like dock that out of your hours. So usually it's like if nobody's actually providing services that IHSS would pay for, then just say that on the form. Transportation is one that comes up when they'll say something like, sometimes kids have, 4 or 5 appointments a week, maybe more, maybe 6 or 7 appointments a week, and you're spending hours every week driving them to appointments. And they'll say, well, that's parent responsibility. Parents are supposed to drive their kids to appointments. So there is an all-county letter that specifies that if the child has extraordinary need that's due to the disability, so you're not going to get hours for their annual checkup, you're not going to get hours for their, semi-annual teeth cleaning. But if the appointment is related to the disability, and an authorized IHSS task is needed on the way to or from the appointment or during the appointment. For example, if your child has protective supervision, or, if your child's potty training or not potty training, you have to stick around to change diapers, then you can get transportation time. You can get wait time if you are required to be there in order to provide a potential IHSS service. If it's one of those appointments where you can just drop them off and go get coffee and say, see you in 50 minutes, you're not going to get wait time for that. If you have to stay there because they might need their diaper changed or they might need a G-tube feed, something like that, then you can get wait time as well. If you get denied, I'm going to talk a little bit about appeals at the end of the presentation, but generally speaking, any Medi-Cal service, not just IHSS. If you get a notice of termination, you should file an appeal within 10 days in writing and request aid paid pending appeal. And that generally means that depending on, there's a few exceptions, but generally speaking, if you request aid paid pending appeal, the benefit or the service would continue at the current level until the appeal is resolved. You can request a fair hearing, and we have some articles about this. Sometimes they will offer what's called a conditional withdrawal, where they agree to do a reassessment if you conditionally withdraw your hearing request, and then just make sure that it's written somewhere that you can reinstate it if you decide you disagree with the reassessment. So Social Security benefits. There's 2 types of benefits that can potentially apply to children with disabilities. One is Title II, which is old age survivor and disability insurance benefits. That's generally going to be, for the most part, once your child is an adult and you start collecting Social Security benefits. So once you start collecting Social Security retirement or disability benefits, any minor child in the house can get a dependent benefit. If you have a child with a disability that began before age 22, the child has not been able to work, and the child is unmarried or is married to someone who gets the same benefits, then your child can continue to get the dependent benefit or then a survivor benefit based on your work record. And this alone, like the disabled adult child benefits alone, could be its own presentation. But I'm just going to say that keep in mind in your head that even if your child gets SSI, when you start collecting disability benefits, you may want to go back to Social Security and say, I'd like to apply for disabled adult child benefits for my child, so that they can get the dependent benefit. And that comes with Medicare. So once somebody's been receiving DAC or SSDI for 24 months, then they are eligible for Medicare. And again, those benefits continue into adulthood, and only end if they become able to work under the Social Security Administration's criteria of work, or if they get married to somebody who's not receiving those benefits. So Title 16 is SSI. It is run by the Social Security Administration, but it is not Social Security that's based on your work history. It is basically sort of subsistence level in supplemental income that is designed to kind of make sure that people have food and shelter. And it's not a very high benefit amount. It's based on both financial and disability criteria. It has income and resource limits. So when you hear people talk about an asset test or resource limits, that's coming from SSI. And in most states, the Medicaid asset test is linked to SSI and is based on the SSI criteria. In California, it's a little bit different. And we can talk about that if anyone has questions, but that's getting a little bit into the weeds. But SSI definitely has very, very stringent income and resource limitations. The definition of disability for a child is more expansive than it is for an adult. So there will be people who qualify as children, but no longer qualify once they're adults. Typically, once a child turns 18, they'll do a reevaluation. But if the child is in special ed, then those benefits should continue until they graduate. And then one thing that you should know with SSI is if the child has an ABLE account, that does up to $100,000, that does not count against the SSI limit. In addition, for children who otherwise wouldn't be able to access Medi-Cal, getting SSI is another pathway to Medi-Cal. Again, like that could be its own presentation, but once you get SSI is linked to Medi-Cal. And so once you get SSI, then you also get Medi-Cal or Medicaid, depending on what state you're in. Okay. And then California Children's Services is a state program that provides various medical diagnosis and treatment services to children with a very specific list of medical diagnoses. So this is not something that's going to provide behavior services. It's not going to provide services specific to children with intellectual disabilities. It's based on medical diagnoses of different bodily systems. We'll talk a little bit about that. But this can be an avenue to assistance for children who are not eligible for the regional center because they have physical and medical disabilities, but not cognitive disabilities. Typically, CCS does have both financial and medical eligibility criteria. So for the medical criteria, it's going to be people with, heart defects, hearing and vision impairments. If your child needs hearing aids, very often CCS will be involved. Muscular dystrophy, blood disorders, cancer, CP, epilepsy. It's all going to be based on specific body symptoms. Sometimes CCS can also assist with genetic testing to see if, or other testing to see if they have a CCS eligible condition. So CCS also has financial eligibility requirements. So you have to be under 21. And the difference between CCS and Medi-Cal in terms of the financial requirements is that CCS has an additional category of eligibility. So first of all, if you have Medi-Cal, if your child already has full scope Medi-Cal, they're not going to look at family finances for CCS. If your child qualifies for Medi-Cal and they qualify medically for CCS, they'll qualify financially for CCS. However, CCS has an additional category that either your adjusted gross income is below a certain threshold, I believe it's $40,000 right now, or your total out-of-pocket medical expenses for your household exceed 20% of your household income. And this is something that Medi-Cal doesn't have, where if you make more than you're allowed to, but your family spends a ton of money on medical treatments for your child, then you may also qualify for CCS. And there's also a whole category for children who have certain musculoskeletal conditions and require medically necessary, but also academically necessary physical therapies, may receive services through the medical therapy program, which contracts with the different education agencies to provide those services sort of as part of the IEP. And there's no financial requirement for that either. So talk a little bit about appeals. Each of these different agencies that I've talked about has its own appeal process. IHSS goes with the Medi-Cal appeal process because it is a Medi-Cal service. Again, these QR links link to our expanded articles on each of these topics. If a dispute is about eligibility for enrollment, so like if the question is, does the child even qualify to be a recipient of that service, of that agency, you can request a fair hearing and file a request for state hearing with that specific agency. If the dispute is about a specific service denial, so your child's already been accepted into the agency as a consumer, but you're disputing a specific service that you've asked for, then each of these agencies has a sort of different process. So for Medi-Cal, if it's fee for service, then you generally go straight for a fair hearing. If it's a managed care plan, which most of our kids have, you have to file a grievance first. If you disagree with the grievance, then you can request a state hearing and or an independent medical review. And our article is going to detail about each of these. If it's CCS, you file a grievance first, and then there's like another layer of CCS appeal, and then you request a state hearing. And then at the regional center, you request a state hearing, but at the same time, you can also request an informal meeting and a mediation. And those will happen before the hearing to see if the issue can be resolved without going before a judge, but it's all the same form. So it's not like a sequential thing. And then with SSI or SSDI, which I don't have on here the appeal process, but with SSI or DAC benefits, you would first file a request for reconsideration, where basically somebody takes the file and looks at it again and sees if the first person made a mistake. And then if you disagree with the outcome of that, then you would file a request for hearing and go to hearing. So I think that's about it today in terms of the presentation. I'll talk a little bit about what Undivided is. Undivided, we have a variety of different services and technology platform and community to sort of answer the questions of what should I do, how do I do it, and who can help me. So we have a digital platform with step-by-step guides, and we have office hours and these webinars and presentations. You have the opportunity to do add-on services with individual subject matter experts, and you can also get one-on-one parent coaching in terms of figuring out what you need to do next. So like I said, we have a platform. It has sort of step-by-step guides where you can kind of walk through the exact steps for what you need to do. You can upload things like IEPs and evaluations and organize it so that you kind of have all your documents in one place and figure out what your next steps are. And then we have navigators who can provide sort of one-on-one parent coaching. Most of our navigators are parents of kids with disabilities themselves. And so they can give you feedback and help you kind of figure out your roadmap for what you need to do next. And then, as I said, we have subject matter experts. We have me, I'm the public benefits specialist. We have an education advocate network, an education advocate. We have a private insurance specialist. I believe we have a self-determination program specialist. I believe there might even be someone who is very familiar with homeschooling. We have just a variety of specialists that you can speak with. Funding options, some people pay privately for membership. We have you can access some of the articles for free. Some people are able to get regional center funding or SDP, and then we also have scholarships available. So that is the presentation. Okay, thank you so much for being here tonight. I hope this was helpful. I believe the recording will be sent out, so hopefully the folks who couldn't make it will be able to still review the presentation, click those QR codes, read through the articles, reach out to us if you think you could benefit from working with us, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Take care.